some of you all have attended these before, some of this may sound familiar, but I did want to at least provide a little bit of background for what I'm going to talk about. So the topic today is an agile approach to implementing ITIL. And the reason why we're looking at the combination of agile and ITIL frameworks and methodologies is that there are sometimes challenges, especially with implementing the ITIL framework within an organization, that can be helped by using an agile approach. So to start, I'll give a little bit of background on the ITIL framework itself. So ITIL has been around for 30 years, or over 30 years now, and it originally started as an attempt by a government organization to quantify and define what their purpose was within their IT organization. There were 40 various books that they developed. It was very much a function-based practice, meaning that they looked at separate functions and everything was relatively siloed. Over time, it evolved into a process-based practice. And in 1999, it was really a major point of major progress, because now they've taken these 40 separate books and consolidated everything into 2 separate books. Service support and service delivery, and some of us who have certifications going back to version 2 still sometimes refer to the processes in those general categories. It was determined, though, that there really wasn't an overall approach to how we implemented services within IT, so in 2007, they released version 3. There have been several updates to this latest version, but it still is essentially these 5 core lifecycle titles, starting with service strategy. It does build upon what we learned and discussed as part of versions 1 and versions 2, but it takes it into a more holistic approach, starting with service strategy in the center. This is the axis of the life cycle. You start with a strategy. From the strategy, the idea is that you will build a set of requirements that you can then pass off to the next phase of the life cycle, which is service design. In service design, you develop a service design package. So you've got this prototype, as you would, and that gets then handed off to service transition. So in service transition, we have the appropriate gates for approvals and testing and training, and ultimately we have a release and deployment package which can be deployed into the live production environment, and that's when we get into service operation. In service operation, that's where the customer or end user actually sees the value in IT. That's where they interact with IT. That's where, as I mentioned, it's the live environment, the production environment, and the output then from service operation is reporting. So we have reports that we provide to be sure that we are measuring the appropriate key performance indicators. That's another term that you'll hear often when we're talking about ITIL. And that gets fed into this final phase of the life cycle, which is continual service improvement, which surrounds the entire life cycle. It's intended to be an iterative process, and you continue on with that, and we'll talk a lot more at the end about continual service improvement, or CSI, as it relates to and really connects in with an agile methodology. So in those 5 books, they're pretty hefty books, and in those 5 phases of the service life cycle, there are 26 different processes that we talk about. So everything from the original strategy generation all the way through to the 7-step improvement process in continual service improvement. So a lot to cover. I think some organizations feel that they need to, and I should put this in quotes, implement ITIL, but really, when you look at the ITIL framework, it is intended as just that. It's a framework or a guide as to what the good practices are for IT organizations, and a lot of it relates to IT support. There is a little bit of a reference to the development of new services. It's, when we talk about the service portfolio and also when we talk about release and deployment management, but I would say that for the most part, when you're looking at application development especially, that really is not covered in detail within the ITIL framework, and we look at other methodologies, including Agile, for guidance in that area. There are a number of products that RightStar works with that can automate some of these processes. So IT service management tools or that are identified as being ITIL compliant or that automate these ITIL processes are part of what we do every day. And I've highlighted those there. So switching gears here for a moment, I've talked a little bit about ITIL. It's the history of ITIL and how it's being adopted by organizations as a framework of good practices for IT service delivery and support. Now I'm going to switch gears and talk about Agile and some of the methods that we have for deploying software in particular. But really this can be applied to any type of service that's being released into the environment at the organization. So some of the methods that you may have heard of before include lean software development. You may have seen Kanban boards. You may have heard about Scrum. So I'm a certified Scrum Master, meaning that I can conduct Scrum meetings with my teams. There's several others listed here. And to go a little bit deeper into a few of them, looking at the Scrum Lifecycle first of all, just to give you an idea, especially if you're not that familiar with Agile principles, what this looks like. So Agile is a methodology that's in contrast to an older methodology, which was the Waterfall method. So in the Waterfall method for development, you would gather all of your requirements up front. You would have a very set list of requirements. You'd send your team away to build based on those requirements. 18 months later, they come back with a product. They're very proud of themselves. Everything works great. And unfortunately, in those intervening 18 months, the requirements of the organization have completely changed, and the product no longer fits the needs of the organization. Agile, in contrast, is designed to, there is some discovery up front, so there certainly is the need to capture some requirements. But that capture of requirements is intended to be ongoing throughout the life cycle of the product. So you want to be sure that you do have the appropriate system architecture review, make sure that the platform that you're using is in alignment with the organization's standards. Make sure that your team is prepared for whatever platform that you're designing on. And then as you look at your requirements, these requirements are built typically into what we call user stories. The user stories are single requirements. Those requirements are then prioritized. And one of the functions of the Scrum Master is then to, on a regular interval, typically 2 weeks, to plan with the team. So you have a Scrum Master, a business owner, and then the implementation team members. You determine which of those requirements from the top of the list, priority-wise, which of those requirements are going to be developed within this 2-week period. And then the development team builds to those requirements, and at the end of the 2 weeks, there is a review with the business owner and a retrospective. What was done well. Is there any need for corrective action as we go into what we call the next sprint? So these 2-week periods are known as sprints. So you have every 2 weeks or whatever time frame the organization determines is appropriate. During these sprints, you are developing, and it's possible that at the end of the 2 weeks, the requirements may shift it a little bit, but you're never more than 2 weeks away from being able to make adjustments. So it's not like you've gone away for 18 months and then kind of climb out of the hole and find out that you're completely misaligned. So it's just as the name suggests, Agile does allow you to take corrective action much more quickly. And then there is still the need to have set releases. So you may have point releases along the way and then major releases. So that structure is still followed. But the hope and expectation is that the end product is going to much more closely match the needs of the organization. And if it doesn't, then it can be adjusted much more quickly. Similar to Scrum, we have this concept of Kanban. Kanban is actually just a set of one requirements or work in progress. So you see here, for example, this is a screenshot taken from Jira. We are an Atlassian partner and work on these projects to implement Jira. And the Kanban board here is showing these user stories or requirements as they move from one phase to the next. So you may start with a number of to-dos at the beginning of the sprint, and then move forward to in progress. So the manager always has, at any given time, the ability to see where the bottlenecks might be. Is the code review taking too long? Again, allows for very quick and agile adjustments as needed. So here we have the Agile Principles. So I've talked about some of the methodologies and how we do Agile. The principles here, and this is in contrast again to the ITIL framework. It's Agile consists of basically 2 pages, all of which are contained within this presentation. It's the principles, and I'll show you the other piece here in a minute, the methodology. So for the principles, customer satisfaction, being able to adapt to changing requirements. We have delivery within weeks instead of months, close cooperation. There's a lot of trust built in to the process, so the team members are, it's not a hierarchical team. There is some management, some guidance or planning, but otherwise the members of the various teams have autonomy. So we have all of these principles, focusing here on simplicity, and they are focused here. You'll see the reference to software. And what I would argue is that you can just as easily substitute the word process when you're thinking about how to implement ITIL in a more agile manner. We want to have working processes. We want processes that are delivered frequently in weeks rather than months. So I think, again, to some organizations with whom we've worked, I think we try to take a more agile approach, meaning that we often start with a single process. And this relates not just to, of course, tool implementation, but just overall process implementation within the organization. But when we're working with the tool implementation, we want to start with a particular module or process, gather the requirements, implement according to those requirements, review, and then put that into the live environment. It allows us to get quick wins, buy-in from the organization, and again, if there are any adjustments that need to be made, we can adapt more quickly as we move on to the additional processes or other features of the tools with which we're working. The Agile Manifesto, again, this can be found online. I've included the URL here at the bottom, at agilemanifesto.org, and very short, to the point. Again, here I've substituted the word process for software. We certainly want to help organizations realize objectives more quickly, not just focusing on documentation, but really getting a working process in place. So I mentioned earlier when I was doing a review of the ITIL history that I would come back to this concept of continual service improvement, which is the last phase of the service life cycle. And the reason why I know this sounds a little bit strange, but in working with ITIL for so many years, I have a favorite phase of the life cycle, and it's my favorite because it's got this concept at the core of Plan, Do, Check, Act, which is the Deming Cycle, and it's also common. It's a standard manufacturing idea. It's not unique by any means to the ITIL framework, and it's certainly referenced in Agile literature as well. It is the basis of the CSI model, and again, it starts at, and you can see the similarities to the sprints and the Scrum Lifecycle that I mentioned earlier. We start with planning, we implement, we review or check, and then based on that, we take corrective action, and the cycle starts all over again. The idea is not that we come in, we implement this monolithic ITIL framework, and then we're done. The idea is that we review the needs of the organization, we determine what a good starting point might be. For some organizations, it's incident management. That's kind of one of the, not optional functions of IT, but it's not it's not universal. There may be other things that the organization needs to focus on first. So again, depending on the needs of the organizations, what the highest priorities, the biggest pain points are, we implement processes based on that. We check. So there are key performance indicators for each of the processes, which allow us to see whether or not we're being successful at the process. And then, based on that feedback, we continue the loop and take corrective action as necessary. So I mentioned that the Deming Cycle is the basis of the CSI model, and this is just the actual detail of the CSI model. What is the vision? Where are we now? Where do we want to be? How do we get there? Did we get there? And how do we keep that momentum going? So I already mentioned that we don't have any proposed implementation order when it comes to ITIL processes. Typically, organizations will have a specific idea when they come to work with us on projects, but for some organizations, depending on the maturity level, they may just be starting out and not know really where to start. We work a lot with organizations like that, and we do have advisory services that we provide to help them to determine, perhaps it's if you're facing audits and regulatory governance, so maybe it's change management where you really need to focus at first, because you may need to make sure you've got the appropriate approvals and documentation in place to safeguard the data that you're working with, especially organizations that deal with perhaps it's HIPAA compliance for healthcare organizations or other types of private information for banking or government organizations. So really it's up to the team to determine what is the business asking for, what are the business needs and requirements, and we base then an implementation order on that. So to kind of summarize and start to wrap up some of the thoughts that I've outlined here, Agile ITIL, I would say, focuses on customer satisfaction. It adapts to changing requirements, and it allows us to adapt frequently. We should be listening daily to the needs of our employees and our end users. We should be measuring our progress. So as I mentioned, there are KPIs. There's a lot of information out there about KPIs for the various ITIL processes, and we want to be sure we are measuring our progress. We want to maintain a constant pace, keep that momentum going, make it simple, allow teams to self-organize. So again, it doesn't mean that there isn't any type of management, but that teams can often work together in ways that we may not expect if they're given the appropriate levels of autonomy. And allow our teams also time to reflect and adjust. So there is going to be some resistance, I would expect, as there usually is anytime there's change within an organization. But if the teams are given time, especially for testing and training, so that they really understand what it is what the goals are of the organization, then that is helpful for the implementation. Some final key points. Prioritization is important. So I mentioned getting together what the pain points are and which user stories or requirements are causing the organization the most pain. We want to see an integration between or among people, processes, and technology. Communication. When I used to teach ITIL foundation courses, I would really focus a lot on communication because I think it is really critical. It's important to communicate the vision down and up. So if you are an IT manager, certainly communicate down to your subject matter experts, the analysts, the developers, and make sure that you're listening and getting their feedback. Also, communicate with your suppliers. Let them know what it is, what you've been dealing with and what your requirements are. Detection. So how do we measure our progress? And then focus on quick and early wins. Again, that's why often companies will start with incident management because it's a fairly routine practice and it's part of almost every project that we do. So it's easy for us to guide you through that and get some quick wins with the organization when they start to see, because incident management really has a lot to do with how you're serving your customer. So finally, I hope I have shown you all that it's not Agile versus ITIL, and I have heard some people say that, oh, well, now that we've got Agile, we don't need ITIL anymore. I would argue that that's not at all the case, that they really have different focus. Each of the methodologies has a different focus. They do both embrace the concept of the Deming Cycle and Plan, Do, Check, Act. I believe that an Agile approach is ideal for the adoption of the ITIL IT service management framework and processes. And Agile can also help to simplify processes themselves. So I think change management is usually the process that we hear about or get complaints from customers about because it can be seen as very cumbersome. But there are certainly ways through an Agile approach where you can pare it down to the simplest form, push approvals down as much as possible, and really see some benefit to the organization and to the service that you're providing to your customers. So, Dick, I don't know if there have been any questions as I've been speaking, but at this point, I would welcome any questions that people might have.
Sure. Thanks, Nikki. It was a great job. So if anybody has a question, there's a Q&A box. You can go ahead and enter that. I have a few questions, so we're going to talk for a little while, just Nikki and me. And while we're doing that, you can think of a question. I'm also, now that I've got the polling button, I figured that I can just hit this button and open the poll. So I don't want to give people too many things to do at once if you're trying to think about how do I ask a question or how do I fill out the poll, and at the same time maybe listen to the discussion. But anyway, there we go. This is an agile approach. You can try to get everything done at one point. While you're doing that, there are a couple of things I just wanted to point out. If you want to learn a little bit more about Agile and this whole space, there's a couple of books that I would recommend. I obviously started off at the beginning and said there's this great book called The Art of Business Value. It's by Mark Schwartz. But there's two other books. One's a real fun read, and it's called The Phoenix Project, and it's really a novel. But if you start to read the book, you're going to kind of feel like you've been there and you've done those sorts of things. So it's about a company that tries to get a new product out the door, a new software product out the door, and all kinds of calamities happen. And I think that's pretty true in any type of organization that's been there and done that before. And then another book that has come out subsequent to that, and both these books are written by teams of people. Both have been led by Gene Kim. And the second book is the DevOps Handbook, whereas the Phoenix Project, you could sit down and you could kind of read that cover to cover because it's a fast read. The DevOps Handbook is something that you're probably going to read or tackle a chapter at a time. And there's a number of different chapters. I think there's about 6 chapters in the thing, and you can start out and just read a little bit and you can kind of move on. But I think the end result is that you really will get some value and have a little bit better understanding of this space and what we're talking about. The one question that I had, Nikki, for you, because you've been doing this and you've been an ITIL expert for a long time. You've also been involved in implementing ITIL toolkits that are out there, primarily BMC related. You've been doing that for a long time. Does it seem to you that the organizations that you're working with have become more mature over the past 15 years or so? Do you see where in the beginning it was let's just get incident up and we'll be happy to have that, and now it's everybody's doing more complex things, integrating incident problem change and configuration management? Is that the sort of thing that you've seen? Have we come a long ways in a short amount of time, or is there still a long ways to go?
I would say there's still a long ways to go, and some of it may have to do with the types of organizations with which I work. So I work primarily with small and medium-sized organizations. Right. I am seeing more configuration management, which used to be the big hurdle. That it's a big thing to tackle. So that is a sign of maturity for organizations. But I would say that there are still organizations that, I think it's because we've become, there's a lot of pressure. There's continued pressure to IT organizations. Pressure didn't end when we got past the kind of the major recession of the last decade. It didn't. The pressure on IT didn't end. So there's still people coming up within organizations who don't have a good handle on some of these concepts. So they're really eager for guidance still.
Well, what's hot right now is, and the tool set vendors like BMC and ServiceNow and so on, they're always trying to be out ahead of each other, and it's understandable because innovation is very important, and if you have the right innovations in place, you can make a tremendous difference in the amount of value that you get out of the system. And what's hot right now is artificial intelligence, and it just seems to me that unless you're one of the top 200 organizations in the world, you're probably not going to implement AI right off the bat at your service desk. And when I say that, one way to do that, kind of sort of what's called cognitive service management, is you have these chatbots. And so instead of picking up the phone or sending an email into the service desk, you ask a chatbot, how do I do this? And without any human intervention at all, it can come back and give you an answer, and it's through this what's known as machine or neural learning, that it can come back and if you don't give it the right answer, then it'll come back with another question until it does try to figure out what's wrong. And you can even, some of the newer AI systems can even go so far as to do self-healing, so log on automatically and then fix the challenge that you're dealing with for you on your own. So the savings are really obvious in something like that, because all of a sudden, you don't have anybody that's at the service desk anymore. It's all done automatically. So I certainly get that, but I think we're a ways off. I'm sure that your customers haven't been asking you about, well, how do I get the latest chatbot up and running? Is that right, Nikki?
Yeah, I would. Although I had it was a relatively small legal firm recently who asked us about bots and how Remedy Force can integrate with that. So that's coming too.
Yeah, I think that'll be fun. That's something for us to look forward to. And certainly there's going to be, BMC, for example, is going to have some kind of cool demos out pretty soon, so you can see what can really be done in this particular space. Let's shift gears and talk a little bit more about Agile. And one of the things that there's been some talk about, and this is coming from Gartner, and of course Gartner's always going to try to lead the pack and come up with this different innovative ideas, but they had this thing called, there was a paper that came out a couple of years ago, and it was called DevOps is the Bimodal Bridge. So if you read the title of that, you think, what are they talking about? And essentially what the gist of it is that within a few years, say by 2020, 80 or 90% of the organizations around are going to really move to more of an agile approach. And, the old waterfall, I might even hesitate to say maybe the old ITIL, some of the workflow processes there are going to become a little bit obsolete. And the way to get there is through DevOps. And so you may have a team of people that have already implemented DevOps within their organization, or using agile processes. And then you have groups that are going to be a little bit slower to get there. And the problem with that is that you tend to bifurcate the organizations within your company to the, sort of the cool kids, which are doing all kinds of fun stuff, maybe with the social and mobile, different apps and agile. And then you have the old timers that are, stuck with the legacy systems. And, there's a lot of legacy systems still left in IT. And so that may not be the best thing for your organization, to have this division between the two different groups. And so I do like the approach, though. And I think one of the things that Nikki, that you talked about was, take advantage of some of these agile tools to implement your ITSM systems. Why not? Because this is something that we shouldn't have to make into these humongous projects that takes months and months and months. Let's roll these things out and use more of an agile-centered approach. Have you seen that too? Have you seen more? Maybe more of a sense of urgency in anything else? Is that, would you say that's the case in some of the customers you're working with?
Yeah, I think for some of the customers I'm working with, they're not necessarily, they haven't really caught on quite as much to Agile in some respects. Although I think when we talk about, to some organizations, probably the more mature organizations, when we talk about BMC's Agile hybrid methodology for rolling out some of these products and implementations, I think that is that's attractive to them. They like that approach. So I think it's coming, but it's a little bit slower than the adoption of some of the ITIL framework, at least, and that's probably just by design with the projects on which I'm working.
Let me ask another topic, and I've certainly read about this a lot, and some of our customers are making great progress in what's referred to as IT modernization, right? It's a digital world out there. And so organizations are saying, we got to get off these old legacy systems, or if they're not on a legacy system, we at least have to modernize some of the old manual processes that we have. And to give you an example of that, we have a couple of customers. One is the Haase reps, and they have been using Remedy to do more than just the IT types of things, and knowledge management is a good example. And it's just a terrific return. You can obviously see how important knowledge management would be on the IT operations side, because if you're dealing with how to fix a broken PC or get something unstuck, if you have a knowledge article that you can pull up and read and solve the problem yourself, I mean, who wouldn't love that, right? But they've taken it sort of a step farther than that, and they've said, okay, well, everybody needs to have knowledge management in any department for whatever you're doing. And so they've started with an accounting, with a finance group, and they've implemented, in this particular case, it's remedy knowledge management, but it can really be anything. And so if you're trying to figure out how do I fill out this expense report, or how do I print this thing out? I can't find the print button on here, or where do I go to get information about the AV setup in this conference room? You can have a knowledge management system that would set up and instantly from your mobile device or even from your regular workstation give you a pretty rapid response. So I like that. But the other thing that I think is it really seems kind of basic. But for example, at the U.S. Department of Justice, they've done some IT modernization, taking some old manual. They have a SharePoint, and they have these PDF files that you have to fill out to onboard people and to request basic services like, I want to work from home. How do I set up the telecommunications link? And now they've using some the concept sort of a service catalog in BMC calls it the digital workspace to do these things automatically, and it's really pretty cool. And then, it's everybody wants this Amazon experience. So I guess, Nikki, you've probably seen, maybe not to this extent that these guys are doing it, but at least a movement towards more of a service catalog in organizations.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think in looking at service requests, there's people want more and more automation. It's, the end users are getting more sophisticated, and they're maybe trusting the end users a little bit more to be able to fill out a simple form, where it used to be that they wouldn't trust the end users to fill out the self-service form.
Okay. And I think that's what, there's just lots of things that you can do. It doesn't cost an arm and a leg. Most organizations have already invested in the software tool and probably aren't going to move to another tool. It's just a question of taking advantage of what you already have, because all these tools work very well. And there's cool things coming down the road like artificial intelligence, if you want to sort of get ahead of that particular curve there. So, I think, Nikki, that's pretty much all that I have. Let me just check the Q&A box to see if anybody has.
I did answer a few of the questions as we were talking. So.
Okay, so you already answered them. Is there any that you would like to share with the group?
Sure. Because I think some of these are certainly common to other organizations. That a frequent complaint or issue is that. Let me pull the question back up here just a moment. So what do we do if, we've got this people being stuck in the waterfall mindset, that they're trying to do this, have an agile team, but there's a particular team, whether it be database administrators or whoever, that they're just taking, you're trying to work within a Scrum, a 2-week sprint, and there's a team that's taking too much time to provide deliverables. First of all, it's obvious that the members of the team are not 100% dedicated to this project, which is a problem, and that the organization hasn't really embraced these principles, and it's my comment to the person who asked that question would be, if there is a business owner, and there should be a business owner who is a member of that team, if you're not able to get any response from IT management by saying, hey, this particular team isn't responding quick enough, or obviously the IT management isn't providing adequate resources to the effort, then maybe the business side needs to start escalating and putting some pressure. I mean, it's you don't want to have to do that, but sometimes it's just a management issue. Also, are there firm barrier, or if there are firm barriers between service operation and design, does that not remove some of the continuous feedback loop of Agile? And I would argue that no, there should not be a firm barrier between any of the phases of the life cycle. I think one of the most interesting diagrams that I've seen, and I don't think I could pull it up that quickly, but there are diagrams that show those 26 processes across the life cycle, across all 5 phases of the life cycle, meaning that, yeah, we focus on, knowledge management in service transition, but really knowledge management extends almost through all phases of the life cycle. It's not constrained to that particular phase. It's just that's where you see most of the activity for that particular process. So likewise, in service operation, we talk about the functional areas. So we've got, the service desk. We have technical management, application management, and operations management. So those 4 functional areas. We talk about them in service operation, but really their work extends through all phases of the life cycle. I mean, they make up all of IT. So although where they do most of their work, most of their activity is in service operation, they are still the ones who are providing the design work for the most part. So they are designing they're designing the infrastructure, they're designing the applications, and it's what we talk about in when we're talking about those functional areas, that they always have this kind of the balance of, there's a balance between trying to design new and change services while at the same time supporting those services, and that can be a juggling act for those teams. But certainly they are involved in, or should be involved in, both of those activities, both design and support. So those were the questions that we had.
What about, did you get a chance to look at the last couple of questions, Nikki, or did you want to?
Let me see here. Oh, okay. No, I didn't. Oh, wow. How to implement incident and Agile when the service team is receiving thousands of tickets daily. Yeah, in that case, the service team is the business user, so they become like if you're looking at the Scrum concept, they become kind of the business user. So they may not be the ones doing the actual design work. And if they need to be involved to that extent, then you've got to be able to have the appropriate. Again, it comes back to, is management going to allocate the appropriate number of resources in order to sharpen the saw, so to say. We've got to have some bandwidth to go back and make improvements to our process if we are going to mature and move forward. Otherwise, we're just kind of dulling the saw every day. What is the goal to moving from service transition to service operation? Let me see, hold on. I'm sorry, this is a 2-part question. So what are some common issues faced when multiple teams are in the process of adopting ITIL? Team 1 uses Agile software development, while Team 2 follows a different criteria when the goal is to move from service transition to service operation. And I think that is where we talk about change management and how some organizations see change management as cumbersome. The developers, of course, don't want to have to be constrained. And Dick, I would probably offer up the book, The Phoenix Project, as a good example of how an organization can really streamline their change management process, so that you're not just looking at.
Yeah, well, the whole idea there is to, and maybe that's not the case in this organization, but typically you might have operations and they're siloed from the development team, and so maybe there's some questions that come up that operations has to answer, and so what do? They got to track down the developers to answer those questions. Maybe it's something like a software bug, or maybe it's just an application that they built and for internal use that somebody has a question. They can't solve it because they're not under the same umbrella. And so I think if it's just from a basic, working together using some of the DevOps principles for continuous development, continuous iteration, you need that continuous feedback loop and get everybody again under the same umbrella in order to be really effective there. It doesn't really matter. Some teams maybe use more of an agile approach than others.
Yeah, and I would say for that too that I just had a thought there when you're talking about when you look at that goes back to an ITIL process of release and deployment management, testing and training, and that should be part of an Agile methodology as well, to have the appropriate, if you're going to have satisfied customers, you've got to have the appropriate levels of testing and training for the systems that you're deploying. So that includes the service desk. They need to have the service desk involved.
Right, to get the feedback, right? To help with feedback. Oh yeah, and it's a whole continuous improvement, which is more of an ITIL, but it's really an Agile DevOps function as well.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, I think that pretty much wraps it up.